Welcome into Pressbox Live. I'm Stan the Fan Charles of Pressbox and PressBoxOnline.com. That guy that is appearing and disappearing is my co-host on these Zooms every Thursday, Gary Stein. Gary, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing good. My thing just flashed. I have a low battery, Stan. I could be in trouble here.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. All right. For some reason, since we added a new camera, I've been looking great on here. Tonight, I look like I'm being filmed like through a hose or something like that. A very weird ambiance. Anyway, before we introduce our special guest tonight, I want to remind everybody that these Zooms are brought to you by the Costas Inn. Everybody in Baltimore, even Gary Stein and Jack Gilden, know that the Costas Inn is a great place to go to sit down, eat your crabs, your crab cakes, crab soup, steak, salads, chicken, whatever you want. But since the pandemic, the Costas Inn has raised their game in the takeout business, in the takeout world, and they have become one of the preeminent takeout places in all of Baltimore. Give them a call, get your food. They pack it so nicely. You can pay in advance, tip in advance, and just pull up and take your food away. Costas Inn, 4100 North Point Boulevard, 410-477-1975. And with that, I do welcome in our guest. We had him on our TV show, Gary, back in 2018,
years ago, yeah.
When his book on the relationship between Johnny Unitas and Don Shula was revealed for the first time, really. It was called Collision of Wills. This time he's written a book about Spectacular Bid. It's called The Fast Ride, Spectacular Bid and the Undoing of a Sure Thing. We welcome you in. Yeah, let me
there you go.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Right. We both got him.
Buddy.
Jack, congratulations on the book. I know you got an incredible rave review out of the Wall Street Journal.
Hey!
Gary Stein, there he is. He's always ready.
I love you, Jack.
Let me just ask you a question. The first book was about the drama between the dramatic interaction between two very powerful men. Early in this book, you make the point in the foreword that this isn't going to be a recitation of what you think you know about Spectacular Bid and what happened, the nail, the pin, the safety pin, Ronnie Franklin versus Willie Shoemaker. You say there's going to be some inside info in here that we don't know. And it seems like dramatically, you've got two characters again in Grover Buddy Delp, the horse trainer of Spectacular Bid, and Ronnie Franklin, the foil, if you will. There's a dramatic thing between the two of them. Is the book at all similar in that path?
I think in a way you can almost, if you did a little backflip, maybe you could see it as a sequel to the other book, because one takes place in Baltimore in the 1960s and the other one takes place in Baltimore in the 1970s. So there is a connection between the two books. And Stan, I think you're very astute to say, to question whether or not there's a similar dramatic structure there in the sense that it's a tension between, powerful men.
Tension was the word I was looking at.
So I think you're right too.
Let me pose the question. Is that something that any book that Jack Gilden writes will have at its core? Is that what fascinates you about the stories that you write?
Well, I don't know so much if it's like the tension between two men so much as it is just the interactions of men in general really are interesting to me. And I think in this case, I think in the case of Unitas and Shula, it was a strange case because Unitas, unlike almost any other player, he had the power to be an equal with Don Shula, and they were, they really butted heads because of that. Whereas in this case, it's really about an inequality of power between these two, between Buddy Delp and Ronnie Franklin. So I tend to see this as really a story of an abusive story.
Yeah. Gary?
Jack, we'll get into the book and some of the characters in a minute, but I've talked to you about this before, at least with Collision of Wills, and your reason why that story was a story that you wanted to write about. Okay. Obviously being a Colts fan and just being a journalist and, really wanting to get into that story. But what motivated you to write a book about the spectacular bid story and about Ronnie Franklin and about Grover Delp?
I really didn't want to write this story. So an old friend of mine had approached me, and he was a friend of Ronnie Franklin's, and he called me up. And this was at the same exact time. It's funny that Stan brings up when I was on your TV show, because, almost to the day of that show, I got a call from this old friend of mine. I'd known him for 30 some years, and he'd said that he had seen the publicity for Collision of Wills, and that he was a good friend of Ronnie Franklin's, and that Franklin was then in hospice care, was about to die, and he was urging me to write about Ronnie Franklin. And I said, well, I'm not really interested in writing about him, because what I did know about him was unappealing to me. He had drug problems, and it seemed to me that this was kind of a cliche story. We all know it by now from hard distance, that these guys, they come up, they're incredibly talented, they get everything they want, they're somehow still unhappy, they end up on drugs or some other horrible thing is going on, they squander it all and they disappear. It's a story that's at least as current as Johnny Manziel, for instance.
Yeah. So
almost the same type of thing. And I was just so sick of that. And over the years, as I'm sure you guys are too. And then, but my friend kept urging me, and I finally went up and I interviewed him, and it still was not appealing to me. And he said, well, let me just give you a few phone numbers. And he gave me the phone number of Steve Cauthen, the famous jockey who won the Triple Crown. And he gave me the phone number of Ronnie Franklin's nephew, a guy named Tony Cullum, who was also a jockey. And so I made plans to visit Cullum at Ronnie Franklin's sister's house. And in the time that I first called Cullum till the time when I showed up at the sister's house, Franklin died. And so when I went into Tony Cullum's, kitchen, his aunt's kitchen, they were livid. There were obituaries all over the country that kind of recounted that story of the spoiled athlete who lost it all. He's a drug addict, and it just harped on him over and over again. And so when I sat down to talk to Cullum, basically cussed me out, told me how much he hated writers, and pretty much, kicked me out of the house. Well, I said, well, wait a minute. I said, I don't like a lot of them either, but I said, I'm here and I'd like to hear what you have to say. And I said, maybe you'll find me to be a different guy. So
Jack, can I ask you to do me one favor? Can
Sure.
you take your glasses off?
Yeah.
The screen is reverberating. No, it's going to be distracting to people.
I'm sorry.
That's
That's all right.
That's
But
okay.
I can't see anything, but that's okay.
Stan, he's a writer. He's not a fashion icon. You
That's
know what I
right.
mean?
You got that right. So he, I said, just, tell me a little bit of something about what he was like growing up or something like that. And we started talking. And so we calmed down and we started talking. And then finally, somewhere in the middle of all the questions, he says, let me tell you something. He said, everybody's writing about it. He was a drug addict, and that's all they care to talk about the guy. He says, but let me tell you, Buddy Delp was the one that got him on the drugs, and he was on drugs till the day he died, and you can quote me on that, he said. Well, I thought, well, now that's interesting and different.
Yeah.
That's a story.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's a story. So, but even then, I wasn't so sure it was a story, because you had one unhappy guy just lost his hero, and he was angry, and who knew what his motivation was, but he seemed sincere and he knew what he was talking about. But I would have to get someone else to corroborate it. So I found, floating around online, I found Gerald Delp, Buddy Delp's son. I made an appointment to go up to see him. He was a super nice guy. Made an appointment to go see him where he was living in Philadelphia. He was
And Delp had passed away,
Delp
correct?
had passed away in the early 2000s.
Buddy. Yeah.
And Ronnie had just passed away. So
Yeah.
Buddy had passed away and Ronnie had passed away. But Gerald was a key part of the whole story, because he was Buddy's son. He was part of Buddy's operation, and he was Ronnie's best friend. So I go up there to meet with him, and I'm nervous about it, of course, because I'm going into his home. And I'm going to have to ask him essentially if his father was a cocaine user and if he got Ronnie Franklin on the cocaine. It was very unpleasant. I didn't know if he might punch me in the nose or something, when I brought it up. So I go in. I shouldn't have worried because he's the nicest guy in the world. He's offering me drinks and something to eat, and and he was in a bathrobe in the middle of the day because he's having terrible problems with his lungs. He needed a transplant. And we sit down to talk. And about an hour into the interview, I said, look, some of Ronnie's family are still very angry. And he said, oh, I know. He cut me off. I know. I said, they say that he started using drugs when he was living at your house. And I said, they even say that your father was the one that got him on the drugs, was using drugs with him. So he stopped and he took a deep breath. He didn't say anything. And then he looked at me and he said, there's no use denying it. It's all true, he said.
Wow.
And
So Jack, is it fair to say then that the interview with Gerald Delp, Buddy's son, was what turned you around and said, okay, now I have to write this book?
I mean, that was exactly what it was. Because everything that Tony Cullum had told me was absolutely true.
True.
And Gerald corroborated it. And Tony was Ronnie's confessor. Ronnie would tell Tony everything. They were, far apart in age, but not too far apart. And they were like buddies. And then Gerald confirmed it all. And he was Ronnie's best friend and he was Buddy's son. And there it was. And that was the beginning of it. In the end, I ended up probably interviewing somewhere around 50 people, something like that. And I quickly knew the story better than any of the closest insiders, because I was the only one that was getting all the perspectives from, the full 360 degrees of it, or whatever it is.
Right.
This appears to be, and I don't want to get too far afield from Spectacular Bid, but this treatment of jockeys is, well, abusive treatment of a lot of people. But I found it fascinating. Was it George Cusimano and Buddy Delp? Was Buddy Delp started dating and then eventually married Cusimano's girlfriend?
Yes, that's exactly.
I mean, that's kind of a weird.
Well, because Cusimano was also his protege, just like Ronnie later became. He was his first protege. So Buddy took him in when he was a young teenager, just like Franklin. He was like a father figure to him, just like Franklin. Cusimano never lived at his home like Ronnie Franklin did, but in most other ways it was a similar situation. And they painted as a father and son type of relationship, but they dated the same girl, and Buddy ended up marrying her. And I thought there was a lot of things that were off there. And that was like one early sign that something wasn't quite what it seemed. And what I found, Stan, was a whole string of young men that he mentored. And in reality, it all came to terrible endings for all of them.
Came to terrible endings. Yeah, he didn't really look out for the people. He used them in some way,
Yes.
I wanted to touch base with you on one aspect of this story. When Buddy Delp, because Gary and I are both about 50, 60 pages into the book, when Buddy Delp realized how good Spectacular Bid was there early pressure on him? Let's get a more, famous name jockey that we can kind of know what we're going to get out of the ride.
I think yes and no. But what's interesting is in retrospect, everybody sees how great Spectacular Bid was. But in the moment, in the contemporaneous to the events, Ronnie Franklin was a star much more quickly than Spectacular Bid was. So the two of them, weirdly, this would never happen almost in any case, but they were trained together at the same time in Middleburg at the Middleburg Training Center by a brilliant woman named Barbara Graham, one of the great horse trainers of them all and revered in Middleburg, even to this day. She just died a couple of weeks ago, 3-4 weeks ago or something. But she was, a superstar in her world. And she trained both Spectacular Bid. She did the early stage training, and she trained Ronnie Franklin and taught him how to be a jockey. They were both there together. Franklin was riding the horse when the horse was like a yearling. He was riding the horse at that farm. So when they got back to Baltimore, the Bid was still kind of being trained, and Franklin immediately started to ride professionally. He won his first race I think it was at Bowie. I can't remember. It was either Bowie or Laurel, but I think Bowie. He won his first race there on a horse named Pioneer Patty. Then he won the next few races in a row. It's very odd that a first-time jockey would win his first race, let alone, then like reel off a string of them. Then he quickly became the hottest commodity going. Everybody was praising him. He was winning on all kinds of horses at several tracks. He was quickly the leading rider at Pimlico, and he was, he was.
And this is a fairly common phenomenon in horse racing when a bug boy, an apprentice who has the weight differential in his favor, is allowed to race like 10, 12 pounds less than other seasoned jockeys.
There's a lot of truth in what you're saying.
Yeah.
But also, too, it's still unusual because of the lack of experience for them to be as good as he was. And
Right.
he was very, very good. And eventually, I don't know, I think he might have been the leading rider at Pimlico that year. And he also, Maryland was known for training young jockeys. They would show up. Remember, we would always hear these names, and then they would go off to big places like Chris McCarron
Charlie Baltazar
and
Eddie
Desormeaux.
Yeah.
Remember Desormeaux? He was so great.
Kent
Yeah,
Desormeaux. Yeah.
Cowboy Jack Canal, remember him?
Yeah.
I love that guy.
Yeah.
Well, Baltimore was a training ground for great young jockeys, and Ronnie was one of them. And so he was well known. And then he got on the bid. He's already, 5 or 6 months into his career. The first race was at Pimlico, and the bid ran against, a very tough field of very well-regarded horses. Not only won the first race, but came within a whisker of like breaking the track record in his very first race at a track where Secretariat had raced. It was a very, very big deal. So still, I don't think that, people like it raised an eyebrow, but I don't think people quite yet understood how great Spectacular Bid was. But by then they were getting used to the fact that Franklin was really good. Yeah. But then as they went on and the bid starts putting up these eye-popping numbers everywhere he goes, and Franklin is, doing a very credible job on him, but they do start to question, should he be the one riding that horse?
Jack, let me pick it up with a little more on Franklin, but I also want to go back to Delp too. So Franklin wasn't a trained horseman at all. He was a high school dropout, basically lived in Dundalk, hard blue collar working family, dropped out of high school, became a fast food worker at Roy Rogers. It was only because of a friend of the Franklin family that kind of had an idea that he could be, I think his name was Taberzi, that he had an idea that he could potentially be a jockey someday, that they even took him to the racetrack in the first place. But my question is, so with that knowledge, okay, about Franklin, he was, he did initially resist the temptation of drugs and other temptations because he was so into the potential racing career. When did he finally submit to those temptations? And that kind of started the downward spiral.
You got to kind of look at his life in sections. So first there was just his early days of being a hot walker and things like that at Pimlico. So you're right, Taberzi brought him to the track. He presented him as an aspiring hot walker just by, whatever, the Delps came and got him, but it was just there was just the luck of the draw type of thing. And so he worked at Pimlico. His dad was driving him. They were leaving at like 4:30 in the morning. His dad worked in Canton as a forklift operator. And so he would drop Ronnie off at Pimlico in the morning, and then he had to get back for his own early morning job driving the forklift. So it quickly became overwhelming. But Franklin started to live at the track, in these little hovels that they have above the barns, and track workers live in them. So he lived there. I think Gerald moved in there with him. They were buddies by then. And you're right. Franklin was clean, and no drug problems, even though there were drugs everywhere, both
everywhere, right?
Outside the gates. Temptation was everywhere. And then he went to Middleburg after that to learn how to ride. And everybody and there were tons of people still in Middleburg, believe it or not, who worked with Franklin in the 70s. And so when I went down there and interviewed them, and I interviewed a bunch of them, everybody to a person said He was, no drug problems, no drinking problems. The one man that was really in charge of him was this guy, Junie Marlowe, who was the assistant trainer to Barbara Graham. And he said he was a reformed alcoholic himself. And he said, no way, he was on nothing. He slept at Barbara Graham's own house.
Just want to put the book up again and let folks know that we're talking to Jack Gilden, the author of The Fast Ride, Spectacular Bid, and the Undoing of a Sure Thing. It's a Nebraska Press publication. Go ahead, Gary.
So when they got back, let me finish, Gary, and I'll explain how it got on. So then when he got back from Middleburg and he won that first race on Pioneer Paddy at Bowie, and then there was a question of where he would live. So Gerald begged his father to let Ronnie live at their house. And he lived with Buddy Delp and Gerald's brother in Laurel near the racetrack. And one day they're all playing in what they called the playroom. It was a subterranean room, like a basement with a pool table and TV and, all the stuff that young guys like. And they were down there shooting pool one night and having fun. And Buddy sent Ronnie up to get a beer for him. And when Ronnie came back down the stairs, all the pool stuff had been removed and they were all snorting coke on the pool table and they offered it up to him as well. So he's doing it right there with his mentor. He's 15 or 16 years old, something like that, 17 at most. And there's a 50-year-old man snorting coke with him right there on the spot. And then by the end of the month or whatever it was, not long after that, he bought his first bag himself at Bowie from another jockey.
It's fascinating. During those years, I was a racetrack fanatic. I was actually a racetrack degenerate. And we always kind of half kiddingly said that Delp, he's going to lose this on purpose, or we knew that some cheating was going on. But boy, the book paints a picture of him being very actively involved with running poorly to set up the odds for the next time out. Knowing
it was more than just setting up the odds, but that was part of it too.
Yeah.
Well, he would bet on other horses.
Well, that I don't know. I don't know that.
I think he was trying to manipulate. He didn't want.
Yeah.
He didn't want to put that much money on a horse that's 8-5 when he can set him up to be 9-1 the next time.
Okay.
I just said I don't know, but that's not really true either. It explains it very well in the book that he was. There was one jockey in particular named Richard Duncan. They called him Dickie Duncan.
Dickie Duncan, right?
He was another one of these proteges, and he was telling him to hold back on purpose, and he was betting on other horses and things like that. So that is true what you said, but there were other reasons too. So you get into some very arcane racing stuff, but they have things called claiming races. So they would maybe hold back a horse so he wouldn't get claimed. And then because they were doing that, making the horse look bad on purpose because they didn't want to lose him, they would then, the next time, knowing that everybody didn't think much of the horse, they would really blast him out of there and bet on the horse and win some money if they could. Right. So there was all kinds of shenanigans.
Let me follow up with a quick one about Delp, and I'm going to preface it by just saying, look, I know the media loves a good story, and they want the narrative to be, because it sells papers, and they want it to be all happy and good and everything. But after reading just the first 3 or 4 chapters, especially your kind of expose on Buddy Delp, I mean, he was a manipulator, like you just said, of horse races, jockeys, horses. Okay, he would electroshock. Early in his career, at least some of these horses, he would, do this to the jockeys that they did, even going all the way back to the 1960s, that incident, that fire at Laurel, where 32 of his horses were killed out of 34. And he just kind of flipped on a switch and moved on from that and showed no remorse at all. I guess my question is, how did the media get it so wrong? Did they just not see it? Did they not put 2 and 2 together? Do they not investigate? Do they not have enough time to do it?
I think
it's so wrong.
They did get it very wrong, but it wasn't an easy thing to discover. I mean, first of all, he was a very appealing guy. So you talk about that barn fire.
That's an amazing story. How he
that's a story into itself.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, he lost almost his entire barn. I guess it was in August or something, and then he had only 2 horses left. the very next day, literally with embers still glowing on the ground and smoke rising from the grass, he goes out to the claiming races and starts rebuilding his stable of horses. So by the end of the year, he was still won like the state championship of the most victories, even though he'd lost virtually every horse that he had. So he was an admirable figure in the eyes of the fans and the press, going way back to the 60s. He was a young trainer at that time, and he was unsentimental. He was tough. He was smart. He was a winner. I mean, there was a lot to like about him. He was also very funny, you know, and he kind of had like a Vince Lombardi style swagger to him. He was a winner, you know, and he had that kind of hard, you know, kind of like a army general type of personality.
I just want to defend the media though, Gary, because, you know, in that era, nobody was looking for big stories out of the trainers. You know, the people that covered racing for the Baltimore Sun or the Washington Post, they were racing aficionados that loved being around the sport. They were not investigative journalists or anything.
Okay, that's fair.
But could I step in?
Go ahead.
I did get significant criticism from some of my friends who are journalists, and some of them were working at that time. And I just have to say, they didn't like, you know, the way that I wrote that up. They thought I was really mean to the press. And, you know, really, you know, one guy said to me, "You never took one shot without taking 5." You know, and so it is very hard on the press. And you know, the way I looked at it, Stan, was almost opposite of the way that you're saying, because I said this was post Watergate. This was an era, it was post Ball 4, when sports journalists and journalists in general were more investigative. I think in general, in the case of Spectacular Bid and Buddy Delp, you saw people that were not on their best game. They were not paying attention. I mean, during the Triple Crown races, Andrew Beyer of the Washington Post goes to Louisville and writes this column, you know, blasting the town and what a dump it is, and, you know, creates a big circus over that. Then when they all came to Baltimore for the Preakness, and look, we all love Baltimore. It's the greatest city in the world, and we love it. We're all, you know, very fond of it. And me especially, I was born here, but it's a city that could take its own shots, you know. I mean, it can be, people can trash it. There's a lot here to not like as well. And this guy came from Louisville, he trashed it. And they're going in this tit for tat in these, what I would call really moronic columns. Well, meanwhile, you have this teenage boy who's in the center of all of this pressure, and he's acting out in very odd ways. It looks like he's having a nervous breakdown, and they seem to be utterly oblivious to it all, except they keep more criticism and pressure on them. And I thought it was really unseemly. And especially considering now we've seen horrible things happen with young people and sports coaches, like at Penn State, like at Michigan State. And with the lens of time, we can see, you know, terrible things can happen if responsible adults aren't doing their jobs, aren't paying attention, and aren't understanding that they're just young, fragile people, you know, and there was no understanding of that. There was no appreciation for what that kid was going through. And they took their eye off the ball, I thought.
Yeah. Well, there's no question that Buddy Delp was not a likable character at all. I wanted to get back to one thing. When he first started working at Pimlico, there was a woman, I forget her name right now, that was working for Buddy Delp. She was sort of like his training coordinator.
Kathy Rosenberger.
Kathy Rosenberger. And she was trying to teach Ronnie Franklin. Clearly didn't just want to be a hot walker. He loved the concept of being a jockey. And she was like very keen on that idea and wanted him to learn. And Buddy Delp like kind of cut her off at the pass. And she says, Buddy Delp says, "I've got plans for Ronnie." What were those plans for Ronnie? Did they include him developing him as a jockey, or was it something more sinister?
Well, first of all, let me just say a thing about Kathy Rosenberger. She was one of the main sources for the book, and she's a fascinating and brilliant woman. I mean, she came
across very positively.
Yeah, well, she was very successful at everything she ever did in life. She was a successful horse trainer. She owned her own farm, she and her husband, and she was just a very bright woman. And so when she tried to kind of get him started, she could see he had the qualities of a jockey. I think she was kind of brushed aside as like a woman, you know, like, we don't need your advice. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Go out there and ride that
All right.
pony and keep your
That
mouth
makes
shut kind of
sense.
thing.
That makes sense.
But so his plans for Ronnie, which is what your real question was to send him to Middleburg and have him tutored by Barbara Graham. I know that's a little at odds with what I just said, because Barbara was also a woman, but Barbara was, you know, she was well known as
Considered, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Buddy Delp, for everything we've criticized him for, was incredibly shrewd at the horse racing game. This was by far the best horse he ever saddled, though, correct?
Well, not only him, but you could say pretty much anybody
Pretty
ever
much
saddled.
anybody.
This
Yeah.
horse was at least the equal of Secretariat, and you could make a very strong case that Spectacular Bid was better than Secretariat. A very strong case. So I think, yeah, it was the best horse that he ever saddled. It might have been the best horse anyone ever saddled.
Let me ask you a quick question, Jack. For a horse racing fan, this is obviously a must read, probably a sports fan in general. If you're not a horse racing fan, why would you read the book?
Because it's a great story of human behavior, the way people treat each other, the way people are treated when they're in relationships of unequal power. You know, it's a book on so many things. One of them is the way we treat our children. Another aspect of it is how we treat the minorities in our society, because one big aspect of the story is the rise and brilliance of the great Latino riders, the great Hispanic riders who came sweeping into the United States and in the early 1960s. Some of them were already Americans because they were from Puerto Rico, but the others from Latin America, and they all came into the United States, or the mainland in the case of the Puerto Ricans, and they dominated. There was one old trainer who was already almost 100 years old in the 1960s. He'd seen the entire expanse of American horse racing. And he said in the 60s in Sports Illustrated, these guys have just shown up and they have all the makings of great riders. They're eventually going to take over the whole thing. And it was probably, you know, a year or two before that was true. Guys like Cordero, Angel Cordero Jr.,
Rolio Baeza, Vasquez,
Gustini's, and especially Jacinto Vasquez, a great rider and a great man, brilliant. And then, of course, there was the underrated Ruben Hernandez, who, you know, he's a mediocrity, even in his own mind, supposedly. And then he comes out with the biggest coup of all, the biggest upset in racing history in the Belmont Stakes, when he rides Coastal to victory over Spectacular Bid. So the Latino riders, I just can't stress enough how fascinating and how great they were, and what great characters they all made for literature.
We have just scratched the surface tonight on this. We're going to call it quits now. Just tell us, though, how is the book being received right now? And is this a great time with the Triple Crown, the Triple Crown season for the first time being back in normal times, starting up in a month or 3 weeks, first Saturday in May?
Well, the book
timing is great, isn't it?
I mean, it appears to be, but it wasn't by accident. The smart marketers at the University of Nebraska planned it to come out at this time, and then we've been very lucky. The marketers, the public relations people in Nebraska, sent the book out to the Wall Street Journal, and they, you know, liked it. The review was very positive, and the book immediately jumped to become the number one bestseller in horse racing on the Amazon list, and 2,000 out of ranked number 2,000 out of 8 million books on Amazon. So it really jumped way up there, which is pretty good for me because I'm an unknown guy and not really a big commodity. So that was really exciting for me.
Well, in reading the first 60 pages, you've done a tremendous job. The book is The Fast Ride, Spectacular Bid, and I love the other subhead, and The Undoing of a Sure Thing, because that race that he lost in the Belmont, it was like watching Mike Tyson lose to Buster Douglas or something like that, or Virginia losing to UMBC.
UMBC, right.
Yeah.
Hey, and you know what? I just want to chime in and say to anybody watching out there from Baltimore, okay, Jack does a great, and I'm not even from Baltimore, but I've been here for 35 years now. Jack does a great job of developing the history of Pimlico, you know, who owned it, you know, the Maryland Jockey Club, the history of that. I mean, you're gonna find out things in this book from the Meyerhoff family that just to a Baltimore person really is important and rings true.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better, Gary, and I'm sorry I stepped on you. Reading
No
about
problem.
George Mahoney and
George
all
Mahoney.
that was fabulous stuff. You've really done a
Great
great
writing,
job.
Jack.
And even Bromo Seltzer.
Bromo Seltzer, right?
And Stan, I just want to say, and it all begins 5 seconds out the front door of the Costas Inn. Ronnie Franklin's family lives just mere minutes from the Costas Inn. So.
What better timing than that? The Costas Inn has brought you this Zoom video tonight. The
Well,
Costas
thank you
Inn,
for the Costas Inn.
everybody knows the Costas Inn is a great place to go sit down and
Sure
eat
is.
and watch sports. But now they've stepped up their game. Preeminent place to get takeout, carry out there. 410-477-1975. I just want to say one thing. We've known each other now since I knew you before you wrote the first book, Collision of Wills, and we'll like each other no matter what. But remember when somebody told you about this story, you didn't like the idea. I gave you a story that Gary can corroborate that should be your next book.
I'm looking into it, Stan.
We've got, and the guy's still alive.
Guy's still alive. In fact, we had him on our
talkable.
show.
It's a great story. Great story.
Well, I'm looking into it.
We're big fans of yours, Jack. And let's see what we can do about getting this book even more popular than it already is.
Thanks,
The
Stan.
Fast Ride.
I love seeing you guys, and
Spectacular book.
really enjoyed it. Have a great
right.
night, guys.
All right. See you soon. We'll be back next Thursday night. Gary Stein and I. Gary, we will have. Do you see what's wrong? Something happened tonight where I'm like there's like a filter over the camera or something like that.
Well, that's your hand right there. Yeah.
No, that was my hand, but there's like a filter there. Next week we will have Kevin Byrne on.
That's going to be great next week.
PR guru with the Baltimore Ravens. We'll talk to him about how much more relaxing it is to be doing what he's doing now than be a week away from the NFL draft.
He's got a lot of great stories to tell us about Ravens draft past.
Yes, he will. Okay. Gary, thanks again. Always a pleasure talking to you. See you soon.
You got it.
See you guys. Bye.